Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Livable Community Series webinar. Today's webinar is titled, How to Create a Bicycle Safety Action Plan Off-Road Facilities, and we will be speaking with Christopher Dowse with the Federal Highway Administration, Bill Schultheis, Vice President and Senior Engineer with Tool Design Group, and Peter Lagerwey, Seattle Regional Office Director with Tool Design Group. This is the third of 3 webinars in October exploring how to create a bicycle safety action plan. My name is James Gallagher, and I'm the PBIC's Communication Manager, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. For more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can also stay abreast of PBIC webinars by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and in improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at pedbikeinfo.org/gettraining. Now I'd like to welcome and thank Christopher, Bill, and Peter for their presentations. We'll take questions at the end. Christopher, take it from here.
Thank you, James. Welcome, everybody. I'm Christopher Dowse with the Federal Highway Administration, and I am proud to be an employee of the Federal Highway Administration. We have some excellent pro-bicycle, pro-pedestrian policies in place. Back in 2010, we had the U.S. Department of Transportation statement on bicycle and pedestrian accommodations and regulations, which talk about incorporating safe and convenient walking and bicycling facilities into transportation projects, that every transportation agency has the responsibility to improve conditions and opportunities for walking and bicycling and to integrate walking and bicycling into their transportation systems. And we encourage everybody to go beyond the minimum standards and really consider how to provide safe and convenient facilities. And with that, there are also some equity and environmental justice considerations. Next slide, please. One of the items, actually I'm also going to say why I'm proud to be a Federal Highway Administration Department of Transportation employee, is when Secretary Fox spoke at the Pro Walk, Pro Bike, Pro Place conference to talk about a new plan dealing with pedestrian and bicyclist safety back in September. That was a time to stand up and be proud. One of the things that we're really concentrating on now is networks. A network is how we get around from point A to point B. Networks include a combination of facility types for seamless travel across bridges and other barriers, perhaps through tunnels. It's a connected pedestrian and bicycle network. It includes both on-road and off-road facilities. And this is how we have a seamless transition between different facilities. The shared use path and the trails can be part of that network. Next slide, please. Slide. This has examples. Some projects that can improve networks. You could add bike lanes as part of a routine resurfacing project, and you can link bike lanes and another shared use path. Or a community can construct a shared use path to connect a neighborhood to a school, shopping center, or a healthcare facility. Or a community could link together a combination of sidewalks, shared use paths, or other kinds of trail facilities to allow children to walk to school and bicycle safely. When you have your communities, think about how a trail connection can bring neighborhoods together. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about integrating transportation and recreation. It isn't either or. Very few trails are purely recreation or purely transportation. We can and should integrate our recreation infrastructure. Recreational trip is still a trip if there's a kind of purpose. If I want to go from my house to the park and I decide to walk on a trail rather than drive to the park, that is still a transportation trip. If I even use a trail and then end up stopping at a shop or a restaurant, that is still a transportation trip that I didn't take by motor vehicle. In the photos here, I cannot tell if the people on those, I can't tell if those people are having recreational transportation trips. One of them is coming out of Seattle. The other's going into Salt Lake City. The other one's in Chattanooga. I don't know if people on those facilities are out there for recreation or transportation. Next slide, please. When you do your trails, you must consider bridges and overpasses. These are photos of trail bridges. One is over the Willamette River, one is over Interstate 75, one is over the Hudson River, one is over the Arkansas River, and one is over Interstate 75 in Florida. The top one, snowmobiles, is in Michigan, obviously. If we want networks, our bridges and overpasses must accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists. I heard at one conference recently we don't determine whether or not to build a bridge based on the number of people swimming across a river. Similarly, the argument that nobody is walking or biking there now isn't really valid if people aren't walking or biking because there is no facility. If you build it, they will come. Also, a bridge is a long-term investment. If you don't add that sidewalk or bike lane or provide a shared use path facility on a bridge now, you are losing a 50 to 100-year opportunity to get a facility across. Next slide, please, on tunnels. Same message. The first, on the top left, you see this is near Seattle. I understand that by putting a trail between two neighborhoods under Interstate 5, you connected two neighborhoods that were not connected before. On the bottom left, near Denver, you have a ability to get under a railroad. And then tunnels, of course, you can actually provide a better grade. Next slide, please. When you do our off-road facilities, again, trails can be used for transportation purposes. I have lived in a location in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where people routinely use horses for transportation. Not all trails necessarily have to be paved. There is no federal requirement to kick off the equestrians. I think that we can get along. And finally, my last little snide remark here is just because somebody is smiling doesn't mean that a trip is transportation or is not transportation. Yes, we can get along. We can have transportation and recreation be integrated and that way get our networks to actually operate seamlessly. Next slide, please. Is just we have some resources available at this location, and so these two sites are presentations about how to accommodate both recreation and transportation on shared use paths and on recreational trails. And finally, you will see there's some young people here. There's some people with disabilities here. When we design our facilities, we have to consider all users, regardless of ability level, regardless of who they look like, what their age is. Everybody deserves safe and seamless transportation. Thank you, and that is my part of the presentation. Bill, on to you.
Great, thank you, Christopher. It's wonderful to follow after that opening. I think as we mentioned in the prior webinars, you can't overemphasize the importance of networks when it comes to bike and pedestrian access and safety. Continuing on that theme today, we're going to be focusing on off-road bicycle facilities and then speaking to countermeasures to common safety challenges we have with shared use paths. I'll lead off the webinar today. Peter will follow up and then speak to some specific countermeasure approaches. At the end of this series, you'll be able to further recognize the importance of networks and trails for cyclist safety, whether it's on trails, shared use paths, or on road. Understand the relationship of how planners and engineers work together to develop bike plans that address safety needs. Further understand the challenges we have as working with bicyclists as a very diverse subset of transportation travelers with various ages, a wide range of ages and abilities. Last, to understand good practices and effective countermeasures to enhance bicycle safety and accessibility. This is our third webinar. This is our last webinar. Hopefully you've been able to participate in the first two. If not, you'll be able to download those off the PBIC website. So today, I'm going to give you, again, an overview, similar to the last few webinars. So we're going to obviously need to rely on good shared use path design to have a safe facility, and a couple important resources for you are obviously the AASHTO Bicycle Design Guide, the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the METCD, and we spoke about the Urban Bikeway Design Guide in the last webinar for on-road. That doesn't necessarily have a focus for shared use paths, but it does have some good design guidance for arterial crossings of like bike boulevards, and there are some similarities and things that you could look to for design guidance for shared use paths that have some similarities to some of the bike boulevard treatments. Another very important resource is obviously the U.S. Access Board, and Christopher mentioned a few of these resources, but here again is a web address where you can go and gain some understanding of how the Access Board treats shared use paths. And lastly, you'll look to local design resources at the state and local level. Here's a couple examples. Wisconsin DOT and many state DOTs have some basic shared use path design guidance that's particular to their state. In many cases, it adds a little bit more context or detail and supplements the AASHTO Bike Guide. And then some areas, for example, the city of Raleigh, they actually developed a very detailed, specific design guide for their city and region. So an overview of the safety challenges that we have. This is, again, same statistics as before. Generally, cyclists are over-accounted for in traffic injuries as compared to the general population, as compared to the amount that they are exposed to traffic. Common crash types that you have on shared use paths. When you look at those crash statistics, what you're going to find is that they're generated by police reports typically. So you're going to only get the subset of crashes that are typically associated with intersection crashes, crashes with motor vehicles. There's a whole subset of crashes that happen along the path that are often not captured. They're not reported, or they're just hospital injury type crashes, but because there's not a vehicle involved, there's not an official police report. These types of crashes tend to be with other users. Could be bicyclists with pedestrians or bicyclists with other bicyclists. It could be collisions with fixed objects such as railings or bollards. And it could, a good many of the crashes are as likely to be falls where there's inattention or surface defects. When you're looking at crash data, and this is just an example again from City of Denver, when we were looking at the crash data there, we found, again, this is only oriented to crashes that are reported by motorists. There was a large percentage of crashes that were coded as bicyclists riding in crosswalks. What you need to do is look into that a little deeper and see how many of those bicyclists were in fact riding on a side path or shared use path and were not on a sidewalk. There's a lot of the standard crash report forms don't make a distinction. So it's an important thing if you're looking at improving shared use paths or trail safety to look a little deeper into the crash statistics. Two common types of crashes that you'll find on side paths in particular are the right hook across a wrong-way bicyclist. It's the image you see on the upper left. A cyclist would be approaching from the driver's right. The driver's looking to turn right, but they may be looking left for a gap in traffic. Another very common crash is the broadside, where they're crossing the street, and the driver's looking for a gap in traffic, and a cyclist comes off the trail into their view. A very different thing that you need to understand compared to the last webinar where we talked about bicyclist safety on the road is a shared use path is a very complex environment. We have a lot of different users, from pedestrians who may be people with disabilities, people that are walking dogs, they could be running, could be children, you have inline skaters, kick scooters, and then you have a wide range of bicyclists. It's just there's a lot more variability in the users in the shared use path environment. Something you may want to do to further understand how to approach making safety improvements for your trail, or if you're initiating a design of a trail, is to kind of understand the more common breakdown of those different users in your community. Here's an example from a trail safety study that University of Connecticut put together, and you can see that at different trails, they have different compositions of walkers to bicyclists, and this could influence how you approach addressing safety problems or trail design. Two other important users to not forget are motor vehicles. Obviously, they're not intended to be operating on the facility, but they're necessary for maintenance. You also have snowmobiles in certain climates that have their own operational challenges in a shared use environment. And the last user, as Christopher mentioned, is many cases you can have an adjacent bridle trail, or it could even be a shared trail if it's just a soft surface shared use path situation. The example you see here is the WNOD in Virginia, and that actually has a paved shared use path with an adjacent bridle trail that's soft surface. This is an interesting graphic that actually just visually shows another aspect of the challenges that you face in shared use path environment. Is the wide range of operating speeds of the different users, from the slower speed pedestrians who are walking to the faster speed cyclists. And you get the range of use everywhere in between. These matter when it comes to design, because you have to be thinking about the approach speeds to intersections, the approach speeds to the users between each other. So you have bicyclists approaching generally from a 12 to 30 mile per hour to an intersection. You have motorists that could be approaching 50 miles an hour to as high as 55, 65 miles an hour, and if they're speeding, could be even faster than that. The other consideration you have, obviously, in a shared use environment is the pedestrian. You have to design for them crossing a street, and they're designing for the slowest speed that they cross, which is typically 3.5 feet per second. Another important consideration is that the AASHTO guide is recommending a marked crosswalk for all path crossings as a standard approach to shared use path design. This is critical for mid-block crossings, because unless you mark the crosswalk, there is no legally established crossing point. Side path locations, if the crosswalk's not marked, it's still a legal crossing, unmarked crossing. However, again, I think it's important to think about the fact we're trying to draw attention to the crossing, so that, again, the AASHTO guide recommends a marked crosswalk. Lastly, you have to consider how are state laws treating bicyclists. Are they equal to a pedestrian in a crosswalk, or are they supposed to dismount in the situations where they're treated as a vehicle? The last webinar we talked about road safety audits to assess bicycle safety. You can also do a path safety audit, and a couple things you might be thinking about is observations. You know, what are the mixes of users you have, the volumes of use, how fast they go, what are their behaviors, what are the surface conditions, and then you're also going to want to follow up and check, you know, is the path meeting acceptable design criteria? Does it have signs that are in conformance with the METCD? Do you have custom signs? Do you have adequate sight distance at your intersection? So these are just some example prompts that you might want to ask if you're to go out and do a safety audit of a trail. Crash countermeasure resources. Obviously, BikeSafe's an important resource, but as we mentioned the last time, that there's not a lot of countermeasures that have been developed for bicyclist safety. And that's as true when it comes to shared use paths. So I think when you come to look at countermeasures, what you're going to find is a more valuable research resource for you is actually realizing that a lot of the pedestrian safety resources and countermeasures are very valuable for shared use path situations, street crossings. So those are two good resources for you to look to, is the NCHRP report for the Guide for Reducing Collisions with Pedestrians, and the PedSafe to complement the BikeSafe pages on the PBIC website. Another seminal report, obviously it's been referenced a lot through the years is the safety effects of marked versus unmarked crosswalk study at uncontrolled locations. It's had a strong influence on the update of the AASHTO Bike Guide. It's a reason that there's a recommendation for marked crosswalks at all shared use paths, because what it will trigger is additional engineering measurements at locations that are uncontrolled, that are higher volume or higher speed, to make sure those are safe crossings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter to talk about some of the potential countermeasures for very common situations.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Okay, I'm going to focus on some of the countermeasures, and I'm going to first talk about some mid-path kinds of crashes that can occur and some of the countermeasures, and then I'm going to move over to crossings and intersections where typically probably more of the serious crashes occur. One of the things that we know is that quite often there's user crashes just due to user conflicts. As Bill just mentioned, you have a wide range of users on trails, and from pedestrians and bicyclists, and then various other types of users. And so one of the things that we always look at right away when there's user conflicts is just to look at the width of the path. And there's the calculator here. You can see the user street guide and look at level of service, and then look at either current use or anticipated use, and start looking at what kind of width that you need for the different volumes for both pedestrians and bicyclists. Also, the new 2012 AASHTO guide provides some guidance, 10-foot minimum. You really need 11 feet if you're going to be passing. 10 to 14 feet is typical. I think you're seeing a lot more communities go to the 12 and the 14-foot width. If 8 foot can be used as a constrained minimum, but then you're going to need to augment that with signs and things that say narrow path, and really should be kind of a last resort. One of the things to think about too, again, is the mix of pedestrians and bicyclists, the type of users, and what we're discovering is this is really a story of success. When we put in the trails, especially if they're connected, they tend to be used and used a lot, and so we really get into the question of width. The other question that comes up at some point is it full? And so at some point you may decide, well, this is the capacity we want, and so at some point maybe we're not going to widen it as well. Some of the things that can be done in terms, again, of countermeasures, and this is alleviating some of the conflicts potential between bicyclists and pedestrians. You can see in the image here, you can use things like striping, just striping off an area for the bicyclists, for the pedestrians. You can use color. I'll show you another image of that in a minute. You can also use physical barriers to separate them, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. When you do have a separate place for pedestrians, you want to have a 5-foot minimum, and for the cyclist, again, prefer to have 5-foot minimum in each direction. One of the things you have to be careful for is that if you do provide the separation, you can see the different coloring in the pavement here, separating the pedestrians and the bicyclists, is that you need to have enough bicyclists. In other words, in this situation, you probably want a higher volume of bicycles than pedestrians, because if you design it so most of the space is allocated to the bicyclists, and yet most of the users are the pedestrians, then you're going to have a challenge there, and the pedestrians will soon just ignore where they're supposed to be and walk everywhere. So you really want to look again at who's using the facility and where they're going. Another thing that you'll notice about this image is the wide pedestrian area is on the water side, and that's where the pedestrians want to be. They want to look at the water. And again, one of the rules of thumb here is that good engineering invites right use. So really think ahead of time of where would the pedestrians naturally want to be, and that's where you should put them. You don't want to put them, in this case, away from the water. Another way of separating bicyclists and pedestrians is to do it vertically. In this case, there's a little bit of a curb between the center area where the bicyclists go and then the walking area. You'll notice on this one has a pedestrian walking area on both sides. And again, both sides provide view to water, and so you're going to find that pedestrians are drawn to both sides of this bridge. Another countermeasure, again, when you're looking at separation, is to take this a little bit further and provide an actual barrier. In this case, you can see some of the lampposts and the bollards providing a barrier. You can also see here, again, they use color and pavement to really create a sense of where the pedestrians should be and where the bicyclists should be. And I think in the picture, it really does a good job of messaging where you should be. You just figure it out instantly. You don't need a lot of, there is the signs there, but it sort of tells you right away where you should be, and that's good design. A few things about where one path meets another path. One of the things that you want to look at, just like you would any intersection, is to look at sight lines, be able to see each other as the two paths intersect. Paths should also intersect at 90 degrees, and we know when we're doing roadway crossings, we prefer to have roads meet at 90 degrees. Same thing goes for pathways. Additionally, don't build in sort of fakes. You don't stagger the trail in a way if it's not needed. In other words, you might have a path coming in from the side, and then you go onto the main trail for, say, 20 feet, and then you make another turn. There's no need for that. So if you do have a crossing, just bring it across all the way. Don't stagger it. Lighting, this is really important. And when you start looking at your crash data and you look at sort of exposure, when are people biking, and then you start looking at what time of day the crashes are occurring, usually you're going to find a disproportional number of crashes at night. So certainly on trails where nighttime use is permitted, you want to start thinking and looking at lighting. Again, go back to the pedestrians in terms of scale and fixtures. If it works for the pedestrians, it'll work for the bicyclists. And then obviously you want higher illumination at crossings because, again, you want the motorists and the bicyclists and the pedestrians to be able to see each other. A little bit on maintenance. A lot of times their crashes that are just single bike crashes are due to maintenance issues. I always sort of make 2 points about maintenance. One is that a lot of maintenance problems are caused by water. And so it really starts, good maintenance starts with good design in the beginning. When you build a trail, don't skimp on the drainage. Don't skip on making sure that you can deal with the water that comes, because when the water does come, of course, you get a situation like here where you start getting, in this case, sand, but gravel or whatever on the trail, and it also can undermine the integrity of the pavement as well. So good maintenance always starts with a good design in the beginning, and then obviously you need both annual maintenance, and then you're going to need some major maintenance from time to time. Part of maintenance is sweeping, plowing, being proactive. And you can see this example here. Part of maintenance, and this is probably, starts to get beyond just sort of annual maintenance of sweeping, cutting the bushes back, but doing some spot repair, being proactive. This is an example of fixing a spot in a trail system. One of the things that, again, going back to safety and countermeasures, one of the things that is addressed in the new AASHTO guide, and something that's been given a lot of attention, is the use of barriers and bollards. And it just says right in AASHTO here, barriers such as bollards, fences, and other similar devices create permanent obstacles and can cause serious injury. So not to say there isn't a place for bollards, and I'll show an image of that in a minute, but the default should be that generally you don't do this, and then you have to make a case why you need it, as opposed to the older way of doing it is, bollards are always needed unless you make a case for not putting them in. So the default is, we don't need it, but certainly there are cases where we do. Sometimes you can be creative. Here's a nice example of a bridge that's been repurposed as a bike facility, and you can see the median in here. It just narrows it up so that cars aren't going to, they're not invited to get through. And of course, and then it's also got the sign, and so between the two, it really does a good job of messaging without having to put up the bollards. But there are times when you may use a bollard, and just a few rules of thumb about a bollard that I think should be kept in mind. One is just what you see here. You always use an odd number of bollards, in this case 3. And the odd one out should be in the center. Everyone's seen trails where we put in 2 bollards in the trail itself, and it channelizes everybody toward the middle, and you have the potential head-on collision. So just a very simple idea. If you're going to use a bollard, put one in the middle, and then you channelize people on both sides of it. The second point is the use of paint, and you can see in this picture here, use the paint to, in terms of shy distance, to move people away from the bollard in the middle, and then with the yellow, and then on the white, shy distance as well. So even if you don't use paint on your entire trail system, using them around the bollards is always a good idea, just to channelize folks and make sure that you don't hit them. You also see the reflectivity. And then finally, again, if you do put bollards in, typically you want them about 30 feet from the road. You don't want them right at the curb or real close to the curb. And one of the main reasons for that is that when you are crossing a roadway and you're on a trail and you're doing a crossing, you really want to be focused on the traffic, the motor vehicle traffic, and not focused on negotiating between bollards. So having that setback can be very important. A few other things. Again, this is between crossings, is you want to think about shy distance. And you can see in the picture here, there's about a little over a foot shy distance between the edge of the pathway and the fence. 2 foot is desirable, but in some cases in a constrained environment, you can go down to 1 foot. But again, you really want some of that clearance. If the pavement goes all the way up to, say, the railing, you may want to consider putting in a white line 2 feet off of the fence line, just to make sure that people really sort of stay away from that. Other crashes are due to curves and speed, and you can see this is quite an example here. Not to say this one's unsafe at all, but it just, when you have a lot of curves and you have some sight distance issues, and you also combine that with elevation, the curves, the speed, the sight distance can be a situation where you could have a problem. I'm not going to go into the details here, but just to note that the AASHTO guidance is there, and we certainly want to look at following it. It gives you ways of looking at, what are the user speeds, what is the design speed. You want to think about stopping distance, and then figure out, okay, do we need to widen this to alleviate any safety concerns? So it gives you that kind of formula and a way of looking at it so that you can figure out if it's going to work. Also point you to the AASHTO guide if you have a soft surface trail. And of course, if you do have a soft surface trail, you do have some advantages in that you can provide more super elevation, a little more slope to it, and it can be greater than usually the 1% or 2% that's recommended, and as a way, again, of making sure that you don't just slide off the trail as there's a turn or something. And again, the guidance is in the 2012 AASHTO guide. So I want to talk a little bit now about roadway intersections and some of the countermeasures that one can look at. I'm going to talk about 3 different types of crossings. The mid-block roadway crossing, the side path, in other words, you're crossing at an intersection, and then just a little bit about grade separated. So here's just an example of a mid-block crossing, and the key here is that it's outside the functional area of the adjacent intersection, and depending on speed and volume, that distance in terms of being outside of the intersection may vary, but the idea being is that obviously you don't want the motor vehicle traffic at an intersection, if at all possible, to back up through the path area if it's too close to the intersection, causing other kinds of challenges. And then the second type, this one's right at the intersection, and it's within the functional area of an adjacent intersection. I'm not going to get into the detail here, but this can also be a situation where you may be combining a side path crossing or a trail crossing with a typical, standard pedestrian crossing. This is also a place where you may do a ladder style for the pedestrians and do something green for the bicyclists, depending on the situation. But again, this is the second type of crossing. When you start looking at types of crashes related to these two different kinds of crossings, typically the one on the left is more straight on. That's sort of your mid-block crossing. And then the one on the right, where you're at an intersection, you're going to have both straight on, but then also the potential for turning type crashes. One of the things that happens a lot when you're building trails is questions come up about who should stop and who should yield, and does anybody need to stop or yield? And a lot of discussion on that, and a lot of, I think, inconsistency in terms of application. Just a couple of things. If you're getting a real high level of noncompliance, it could be that you've got it wrong. So for example, in this case, just a driveway that gets almost no use, and then you put the stop sign on the trail. It could be, once you start looking at the data and the volumes, that it really makes sense to put the stop sign on the driveway crossing as opposed to the trail crossing. I like to use sort of the 85% rule. If 85% of the folks are doing the right thing, then a little bit of education and a little bit of enforcement can fix the other 15%. In other words, you probably got the engineering right. On the other hand, in a situation like this, probably 85% of the folks are just going to ignore the stop sign, and you've probably got a traffic concern here in terms of putting the stop sign up for the wrong users. So again, in terms of the countermeasure, you want to use the traffic control that's the least restrictive. And in this case, you can see here, this is, again, a driveway crossing that becomes dirt on the other side, and it's stopping for the trail. So some of the things, again, that you want to look at are things like volume. You want to look at speed, system hierarchy, and that gets back to the issue of, in this case, a public crossing versus a private crossing. You want to look at sort of the street hierarchy. Is it a local street? Is it a regional street? Is it an arterial street? And then obviously you just want to look at volume. So I think having some good protocols in place for making these decisions is really important. You're not always going to have the same answer, but you really want to think through it. Don't just cookie cutter it and get outcomes where you're having everyone pretty much ignore traffic control because they didn't get it right in the first place. This is a really interesting photo, and this is an example of how not to do it. It really gives a lot of conflicting information. So you start with a signal which is green, and then you see the yellow hand, and then you see the stop sign. So as a cyclist, you're going, okay, what am I supposed to be doing? And it's this kind of conflicting information that you really want to avoid, and you really need to have clear messaging. So again, here, just pointing out the conflicting information here is that you're putting a stop sign up at a signal-controlled location, and it's like, are you supposed to stop for a green light? And it's that kind of situation you really want to avoid. And the countermeasure, of course, is to integrate the side path crossings with the signalized intersections. And one of the nice things is that you now can use the green bicycle. There's been interim guidance issued by FHWA, and one of the things it shows is when it's real clear what signal you're supposed to use and you get that clarity, you get increased compliance. So the next edition of the MUTCD will have further guidance on this, but again, it's that clarity and not having conflicting information. And then some of the other things that are quite obvious. Obviously, you can avoid a lot of crashes if you have good sight distances. In this situation, not only is the sight distance poor, but the approach doesn't come in at a 90-degree angle. And so if you, again, think of what we know about marked crosswalks, by coming in at the angle it does, it increases the time that you're in the street, exposure time as we call it. And so not only is there a sight distance issue here, but also the angle at which the trail comes up to the intersection. One of the few things just on sight lines, and this is something that should be given a lot of attention, and Bill alluded to this earlier in one of the previous slides, but you really want to look at approach speeds, and they're determined by the fastest users. And I'm not sure motorists are going 80 miles an hour, but it depends on the roadway. But you really want to look at what's the motorist speed on a particular roadway, what's the bicyclist speed, and then that helps you develop your sight triangle. Obviously, the other thing you want to do is look at the departure speed. That's where you step off the curb, and that's determined by the slowest user. So that's going to be the pedestrian. It needs to work for the pedestrian at their walking speed. And that's how you look at that speed and then what kind of sight triangle do you have. I think everyone's probably familiar with this, the multiple threat crash. And this is simply where you have car A stopped for a pedestrian in a marked crosswalk, and car A, especially if it's a bigger vehicle, can block the sight distance so that car B can't see the pedestrian, or vice versa. This is resolved quite often by putting in a stop bar back, and I'll show another image of that in a minute. Another countermeasure that works very, very well is a crossing island. You want to use these at high volume locations where there's 3 or more lanes. Obviously, you have to have some space in the middle to put the crossing islands. Minimum width is 6 feet, but if you can get up to 10, it's preferred, especially if you have a lot of cyclists and it's a trail. You may need a little more space there for storage. Again, having them maybe a little extra width and a little extra space, some space is that you can get more than one bicycle there, and you may be passing other bicyclists coming the other way. So more space is typically good. And then, of course, you can see the slight stagger here. What that does is it makes sure that the person using the crossing, whether they're walking or bicycling, is oriented in a way that they're going to look at the oncoming traffic. And, of course, people typically get hit, not in the first half, but in the second half if they forget to continue to look to their right for oncoming traffic. This is an interesting slide, and it's a crossing, and it does a lot of things fairly well, but there's also a few things that could be done better. You can see the median, the crossing island. Here's the example of the advanced stop bar. In this case, they have the triangles. Some states are what we call yield states, and you would have the little shark's teeth here, as we call them, the little triangles. If you're a stop state, you would have a solid line. But either way, this is a tool that's available, and typically you're going to put it back about 10 feet for every 10 miles an hour that the speed limit is set on the roadway. So typically, if you have a 30-foot, that's up to 30 feet. So if you have a 30 miles an hour speed limit, you might want to put that about 30 feet back. And of course, this starts to address that multiple lane threat that I looked at before. You can also see here, you can augment this with not only the high visibility crosswalk, and you'll notice how the crossing markings are located so the wheels of the car don't go over the paint itself, so it lasts a lot longer, helps the maintenance budget, and helps for safety. And then, of course, there's the rapid flash beacons here as well that are proving to be very, very effective in terms of getting higher compliance with motor vehicles. A couple things that probably could be done better here. You see some of the vegetation in the middle, and really want to make sure that you have that clarity and see-through, which it looks like it's starting to go away on this image. And then, of course, if you look on the right side, you see a piece of missing sidewalk. and you see the little goat trail, the Desire Trail there. One thing that's always interesting, too, when you look at the little goat trails, notice how it's 4 or 5 feet back from the curb. People don't want to walk right on the curb, what we would call the splash zone. At the same time, typically it's where we put the sidewalks. And so if people left to their own devices will design it in a way that works best for them. I think all of you, everyone's familiar with crossing signs, both the advanced sign and then, of course, the sign right at the crossing. And you can, when it's a trail, typically you want a pedestrian and a bicycle, as shown in this image. And again, as you get right up to the crossing itself, certainly having another sign. You'll notice on the right, too, is that you'll see the arrow pointing down. I think most communities are using that now, gone away from the 2 little lines that indicated this is where the crossing is. People just never really figure that out, and the arrow is very effective at saying, here is the marked crosswalk. I mentioned the rectangular rapid flash beacon, and here's another picture of that. And one of the things I think just to keep in mind, too, is how you want to actuate it. Typically, it's going to be actuated. It can be passive, or it can be a button that's pushed. But again, turning out to be a fairly effective tool. So some of the takeaways, and this will be the last slide, and then we'll take questions, is shared use path countermeasures require pedestrian countermeasures. And again, both Bill and I have stressed the importance of looking at pedestrians in terms of their walking speed and designing for them at certain points so that if it works for the pedestrian, it's going to work for everyone else. The fact that comfort and safety have a relationship. In other words, if people feel comfortable on it, and in fact it is safe, that they both need to happen. Land use, terrain, traffic character influence use and safety. We haven't talked a lot about this. I mentioned just sort of my 85% rule of thumb, but certainly education and enforcement strategies are very important. And if it's engineered right, if it's designed right, they can come in and really make it work very, very well. And then, as Bill mentioned, our industry needs more data for crash mitigation factors. We've done pretty well in the pedestrian area, and we can learn from it and bring a lot of that over to the conversation about bicycle design and bike facilities. But certainly, there's room for a lot more research in this area. So with that, we will open it up to questions. James, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Now we have some time for questions. If you have not done so already, please enter any questions you may have into the question box. But let's get started. The first question I received refers to a community where they have a path with a big slope, and already they've had several issues with bicyclists and skateboarders picking up too much speed and crashing off the side of the path, several broken bones, and even one fatality. And their question is, what are your thoughts of various countermeasures to reduce speed, such as signage or texturing the pavement or grooving the pavement, or even a traffic table or lane striping to narrow the lanes? What are your thoughts on some of those countermeasures? Is there anything that you would suggest to help reduce speed there?
Bill, why don't you start on that one, and maybe I'll just start.
Sure.
Part of it is getting the design right in the first place. So if you're, I think there's 2 different situations. One is when you're building it, and you have the opportunity to build it right, and then of course the second is retrofitting in something that's obviously not working very well. In the first part, certainly anticipating a situation like this is very, very important when you're constructing a trail. So it means going back to some of the images that I showed you and using the AASHTO guide to get the design speed right, get the super elevation right, just getting the slopes right, the widths right, those kinds of things. And then also in the AASHTO guide, and we didn't really talk about this today, is certainly there's a lot of good guidance in there about when to put in fences and railings and the relationship of the slope next to a trail to both when you need a railing heights, railing setbacks. I did have the one image on the setback, so getting that part of it right. The other part, of course, is looking at the surfaces, and certainly I know quite often when there's an anticipation that there's a slope and you don't want to encourage a lot of fast use, you certainly can go to rougher surfaces. I know I've been involved in some projects where we were using concrete, and we just when we broomed it a little more heavily, so it just didn't work well for real high-speed skateboarding, for example. And then obviously, if you need to separate different modes, you can introduce the color. Some of those things you can do as a retrofit. Obviously, the best is to do it up front. But Bill, why don't you add on to that?
Yeah, some of the widening that could be done to kind of, again, separate the different speed users could be useful in a situation like that, realizing that bicyclists could be approaching at 25, 30 plus miles an hour, and pedestrians may be walking, obviously 3-4 miles an hour. There could be value in doing that. In that situation, it could be very valuable to actually have that separation not be adjacent to the bicycle part of the shared use path. You may actually want it to be buffered with some vegetation and actually have some separation horizontally to really kind of add an additional factor of safety there. I know some speed limit signs have been tried. I find they're not generally that successful, and it really comes back to the design cues that Pete mentioned as important. I've heard some reports, and I don't know the status of it, but I believe the University of Washington might be experimenting with some rumble strip type textures on the Burke-Dillman Trail. That might be something to Google search and follow up on.
All right. As a follow-up to that, would a high-friction pavement ever be a good idea, or is that too likely to cause fall rashes or road rash if someone were to fall?
I'll just start on that. One of the things that you don't want is a surprise. So you don't want to come around a corner and all of a sudden there's a different pavement with a different texture. You're on a rollerblade and all of a sudden, boom, it's a big surprise. So, if you do use different textures to start managing the speed, it really needs to be obvious that it's coming up. People need to know about it, and it needs to just, again, it needs to message, yep, this is different, and don't surprise people. But just having some more texture and can be a good thing in many ways too, because it also has the advantage in when the pavement's wet, certainly you're not going to slip as much. So it can also have a very positive side.
Okay, thank you. My next question. Do you recommend plowing snow from trails? This particular location's township staff argues it will be more dangerous than less for trail users.
Well, a lot of it comes back to the design of the trail in the first place, and I've seen some places where there's a lot of freeze thaw, and the trail wasn't designed for having any positive drainage, and so you can plow it, but you still end up with ice. And so it gets back to my earlier comment about maintenance. It's really important to build trails so that they drain properly, and then if they're done correctly, then plowing and then also adding sand or salt, whatever you need, it can work very, very well. So again, it comes down to both the initial design and then the ongoing maintenance.
Something that I've seen that's interesting in sort of the roadway end of the world, it's being used a little bit in shared use paths as pervious surfaces. Those do really well with the freeze-thaw issue and can reduce the ice challenge. I know on the streets where it's been used, they're able to reduce the need to salt significantly when you have that pervious surface. So that would be something else to consider. But I would say generally, if you're in a climate and you've got the good drainage, you're not going to have this ice problem. It would be a good practice if this is intended to be a facility that's open to the public and it's an important part of a network, then you should be thinking about this and incorporating maintenance into your budgets so that in the summer these facilities are swept clean of debris, and in the winter they're plowed free of snow and kept ice-free.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you provide some examples of or specific principles to consider when designing successful beginning or endings of multi-use off-road trails at vehicular intersections?
Well, I'll start. I think it's first of all, it's a really good question, and there is guidance in the AASHTO guide on this. I think it's one of the trickiest things to do because, again, if it's not done correctly, this is where you can get things like wrong-way riding and behaviors that can lead to crashes. So whenever there's a transition or something starting or something ending, again, just look at where do people go. So if you're on a trail and it ends, how do they transition to the street system? And will they automatically, for example, end up on the proper side of the street? And obviously you got coming and going. So there's two parts to the question. The same thing as from the street side is somebody's on the street, they're anticipating moving over to a trail. You don't want to set it up so that they go the wrong way on a street just because it's easier to access the trail and then they don't have to cross the street. So this can happen a lot too. I've noticed on bridges where maybe you have on-street bike lanes and then you have a side path on a bridge just on one side, and then all of a sudden you have to go back to on-street. So there isn't one answer, but I think it's the right question, and it's a place where you really want to put a lot of attention and make sure that people are invited to automatically do the right thing.
All right, thank you very much. I know that FHWA has given interim approval for bicycle signals and for green markings to bike lanes. Does it also apply to shared use paths?
Yes, that approval for use of bike signals, it doesn't make a distinction of on-road versus off-road, so a very logical place for them to be used would be shared use paths. The current interim approval is restrictive in its nature that you can only use a bicycle signal under the current interim approval if it's a fully protected phase. So there's no conflict with turning motorists. Now, the National Committee's approved updated language that's going to add a lot more flexibility to that and allow bike signal to be used under a much wider range of conditions. So that's something to take a look at and see if the Federal Highway Agency, when they update the MUTCD, includes that additional flexibility. Likewise, the green, you would have the option to use that on a shared use path if you like. I'm not sure the person's orientation of that question. It could be a crossing of a road. If you had a separate bicycle crossing, separate from a pedestrian crosswalk, for example, you would be able to color that green.
All right, and can you offer any suggestions on how to separate out modes with traffic control when they are together on the shared use path?
Well, I obviously touched on that a little bit, and the tools you have are paint, signs, pavement differences, texture differences, coloring, and then physical separation. And I showed the image of both, I think, some bollards, but you could also, as Bill mentioned, you can use plant material to create that separation. So there's a bunch of different techniques. And then obviously the other one is to make sure that you put the pedestrians on the side where they want to be anyways. And so if you're, for example, again, going along a lake or a river, typically the pedestrians are going to be drawn to that. So that's where you want to move the pedestrians to that side if possible.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on shared use paths within medians? In this case, they're considering a shared use path along a 30 to 60-foot median that runs along a boulevard that has 3 lanes in each direction, and there are several driveways off the boulevard, meaning that the bike lane would have to cross those driveways as well. What do you think of putting the lane in the path down the median of the road?
Median path
Go ahead, Bill.
construction can be challenging. It can be a good idea. There's certainly some good examples of that around the country, from New York City and Washington, D.C. But the most important thing you got to be thinking about when it comes to median path location is the width. And it sounds like there's a pretty good width in this situation, because you don't want the path to be in the middle of high-speed, high-volume traffic on either side of the user. It's not going to be that comfortable. So if you can provide some good buffers to the traffic, then that's a good first check, so that you still have an adequate and safe width facility, that you have enough width to build that and provide those buffers. The next most important thing is going to be the street crossings. If you're in a median, how are they handled at every intersection? Because that's an unexpected place to be seeing people crossing a street at an intersection. So they'll signalize. Can you provide a protected crossing for that facility? Is it a situation where if the median gets too wide that vehicles are storing in that median, it can actually block the path of the users? Those would be things you'd want to be thinking about before you make that final decision.
Do you have anything to add, Pete?
No, totally. But great answer.
Following up on the similar trend, do you have any experience or suggestions with using a shared use path in the median of a diverging diamond interchange?
It's really the same issue, and the criticisms I've seen of the paths that have been built that I've seen that are diverging diamond are challenged in that it appears, based on the projects I've reviewed, there's a desire to constrain the width of the bridge, and so then you end up with a shared use path that's 8 or 10 feet wide with a concrete barrier on either side as a fence, and then the traffic lanes, and there's essentially no buffer to traffic other than a foot or 2-foot space that's got a vertical concrete wall. So those feel like a canyon. It's not a pleasant environment. You're around a lot of traffic noise. It feels very intense. So the goal of that type of design is to minimize the user interaction at off-ramps, which can have a lot of safety challenges, but then they totally degrade the comfort and use of the facility by minimizing all the comfort benefits of being in the middle by having wider buffers. So I think if those are going to continue to be built, that's an area that our profession needs to spend a little more attention on, spend a little more money on.
All right, thank you very much. The next question, do you find pavement markings on paths to be effective?
You know, when you ask a question like that, I guess I always have to answer, it depends. Some can be very, very effective, and some can be kind of throwaway. And it's really important when you put in pavement markings is that they be in the right place, they have the right message at the right time, that they address a specific behavior and not be too generic, and they also address the user that's going in a particular flow, a certain direction. They can't be bidirectional typically. They can, but usually it doesn't work. So it just needs to be like anything else you do. It needs to be very, very thoughtful.
And I'd say the one marking that has definitely proven to be highly, highly effective is a centerline marking at dividing users into paths of travel. So if you're having a trail that's having some user conflicts and it doesn't have a center line, that'd be something to consider.
Just to add to that, a number of years ago I was experimenting with different lines, and going back to the picture, the image I showed is, creating a separate space for pedestrians, like a 5 or 6 foot walking area. And did some observational surveys, and I've seen a few other of these done, and it's kind of interesting is that the bicyclists tend to honor that pretty well, but the pedestrians, maybe a little over half will, and then the other ones don't. So for at least for those pedestrians who are concerned about cyclists, they have a place to go. And obviously some pedestrians aren't concerned and they go wherever. But the compliance tends to be higher on the bicycle side than the pedestrian side in general, not always. And it also gets back to the other image I showed. It really depends on excuse me, the mix of bicyclists and pedestrians. So if you have a facility that's 90% pedestrian and just a few cyclists, those kinds of, using a paint line like that to separate obviously isn't going to work as well.
All right, thank you very much. My next question, do you know of any other environmentally friendly materials besides concrete that hold up well for paths?
You mean like this flexi-pave kind of stuff? Well, it depends.
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned the pervious concrete, and obviously people use asphalt and concrete. Beyond that, I've seen experimentation, with some other more kinds of flexible kinds of things, and I haven't seen anything I would endorse at the moment, but there may be others who know more about that than I do.
Okay, thank you. My next question, are you familiar with any research or scientific data that covers how protected facility networks are an ideal way to get the public to seriously interested in bicycling? And by seriously, we mean more than a 1% mode shift.
Yeah, when people are interested in sort of like what kind of outcomes you get from different kinds of systems, what I always encourage them to do is, a good starting point is, the League of American Bicyclists. They have their designation program where you can be a bike-friendly city. You can be, you can be gold, you can be bronze, you can be silver, and I always look there and look at the top, the top urban areas, and then start going to those websites and digging into what have they done in their communities in terms of protected bike lanes and things like that. And usually you can, contact a local person and also then follow up and get that information. So, I would go to those communities that have been successful, got those bicycling rates up well over 1%. There's good examples of, people getting into the 5% range and more, and go to those communities, find out what they did, and what turned the corner for them. What did they do when all of a sudden they got that big jump, and get that information. So that's usually how I like to start. And that list from the league, changes every year, and we're finding a lot more communities are really diving in, doing a lot of wonderful things, and starting to get some changed outcomes.
This is Christopher Dallas of Federal Highway Administration. I want to remember at the beginning I also said that networks get involved. As long as you do a lot of independent facilities that go point A to point B, but until they start connecting together, you don't get enough desire lines. You don't get enough integrated trips. So when you start working on connecting your networks, I think when the public sees, hey, I can do this, that's when you start getting the shift. Peter, maybe perhaps you could talk about when did Portland's increase really happen? What was some of the thresholds? And the other thing, too, if you don't have an ability to get across bridges or underneath tunnels or across freeways, you have lost your networks, or railroads for that matter. So go ahead, Peter. Maybe you can comment more on that.
Sure, and I'm probably a little more familiar with Seattle, but both. And I would just echo what you just said, is that when you can build a lot of facilities, but when the connectivity occurs is that when you see the jumps. And a lot of communities go through kind of a series of 2 or 3 stages of developing their network. Quite often might start with those sort of trophy trail projects, those great rails to trails projects. Then you soon discover that you're never going to have a trail to everybody's place of residence and everybody's business, and also the trails don't connect. So usually a second phase might be in terms of connectivity, would be connecting some of the major trails via the street system, and those become a top priority. And then from there you go to another step where you start really looking at a whole network that's on the street system, and then start looking at some protected bike facilities where you really start providing that separation and that space. And each one of those steps, you'll start seeing jumps in use. So there might be 3 or 4 different thresholds, but one of the things that, just to go back what we talked about again in terms of separation, when we interview people, we talk to people, and we ask them why they don't bicycle more, we always hear fear of motor vehicle traffic. For those people who are inclined to bike but don't do it a lot, fear of motor vehicle traffic is always the #1 issue they bring up. And so it gets back to the point I made earlier about safety and comfort. So it really is getting people comfortable with bicycling on the street system as well, and a lot of that involves that separation.
All right, thank you for that answer. That was great. My next question is, are handrails required for trail boardwalks that are higher than 32 inches, or are bumper rails acceptable?
Bill, you should. I don't know if I totally understand that question.
Could you repeat that question just for clarity?
Are handrails required for trail boardwalks that are higher than 32 inches, I think they mean more than 32 inches off the ground, or are bumper rails acceptable?
Well, a railing is required. If you're going to have I'm presuming this is a situation where the boardwalk's elevated and that's a drop-off of a few feet. In that type of situation, you absolutely need a railing. And the AASHTO guide recommends a smooth railing, and it could be, which I think is what is alluded to with the bumpers. A continuous smooth railing would be ideal at the top, obviously, and then some lower smooth railings along the bottom so that you don't catch a handlebar or something in the event someone were to bump up against it. I would look at the AASHTO guide. It provides some good graphics for dealing with railing design.
Okay, thank you very much. Does the AASHTO design guide offer differences between trail designs in cold weather climates versus warm weather climates? And are there some specific things people should consider when designing trails in warm or cold climates?
I think I'll just start with it. I think the basic design doesn't change that much, though there's a few things that you want to consider. Certainly in cold climates, the issue of snow storage always comes up. And so if you have a side path, for example, the relationship, the space between the side path and the roadway may be adjusted to accommodate snow storage. I know years ago I lived in Anchorage, Alaska, and they're very purposeful on some of their big boulevards about creating that space for snow so that they could then plow the trails, and it was tied to kids walking to school. So that's a consideration that you want to look at. The other consideration, of course, is what Bill alluded to earlier, is what's the width of your maintenance vehicles? Because if your maintenance vehicles are wider and heavier than the trail can handle, you're going to get the edges being broken off. So, for example, if you're in a cold climate and you have snowplows that are going to be on the trails on a regular basis, and if they're heavy, that might then make you consider a slightly different approach. And then, of course, if you're in a really hot climate, you want to look at your asphalt mixtures and make sure that you don't create something that's going to melt on a really hot day. And typically, you can look for look to the example of the kind of mixes you do for the roadways, and use something similar on the pathways.
Thank you. My next question is, do you know of any state or federal or local database for laws regarding how bicycles may cross at crosswalks? I think the question gets to, in some places they may require bicyclists to get off and walk their bike across.
Yeah, there's been some mixed, I think, laws and rules on that, and also some mixed litigation. I know in the state of Washington, for example, there was a legal case a number of years ago where a young person was hit. A juvenile was hit in a marked crosswalk on a bicycle, and then the question came up. Did this kid on a bike have the same rights, duties, responsibilities as, say, a pedestrian? It was very clear in the law about pedestrians, and it went to the state Supreme Court, and they ruled that indeed they should think of the bicyclist as a pedestrian, and so had to take the same precautions, but also had the same rights as a user of that crosswalk. I don't know, Bill, if you know any other examples. That's the one I'm familiar with.
No, I mean, I think that covers it. I think this is another topic that is going to continue to evolve. I think with the state codes are all going to have to be updated when bicycle signal, now that bicycle signals have been incorporated into the METCD and future revisions to that document expand their use. They're going to need to be defined as a device in all the state codes, and I think it might be an opportunity to revisit this question in your local state of how bicyclists are treated in crosswalks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we got time for a couple more questions. My next question is, do you know if collision reports are commonly taken for bicycle and pedestrian collisions on bike paths and shared use paths? And do we have any sense of whether those crashes are higher or lower than on regular streets?
It's a good question, and typically, I would say most communities I'm familiar with, they do not have really good data on this. Some communities have better data than others. Sometimes there can be data, say, through your local fire department or emergency response. That can be a way to get some of that data, and sometimes people have collected that data through emergency rooms. But this is another area, just like we've noted, that there's certainly a lot of room here for additional research, and this is something that an area where I think there can be a lot of additional research. Just anecdotally, we know that a lot of the crashes that occur on trails are single bike crashes, and it goes back again to the maintenance issue and really designing your trails correctly in the first place.
All right, and I think this will be our last question for today. The latest federal highway bill contained a provision for bicyclists to be required to use a path within a certain distance of a street or a highway on federal land. Do you know why that is, and should use of paths be optional?
I think I better take this one. This is Christopher Dowis at the Federal Highway Administration. I don't think that anybody truly knows who is behind that item that was put into MAP 21. The rumor is that it had to do with a congressional staffer who didn't like bicyclists and wanted to get bicyclists off of city streets in Alexandria, Virginia that he or she thought, because it's called the George Washington Parkway, that he didn't want them on the George Washington Parkway, thinking that section of the George Washington Parkway was national property, even though it's City of Alexandria property. And so that's a speculation. We don't know who is actually behind it. It just, for some reason, somebody put it in and it never got taken out. Our Federal Highway, our U.S. Department of Transportation Grow America Act, I believe, asks to have that provision removed. But until that provision is removed, it remains in law. It is apparently it's as far as we can determine, it is somebody's pet idea.
Okay. Well, thank you all for that. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today for discussion. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question today. A PDF copy of the presentation slides is available currently at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars under the Bicycle Safety Action Plan tab. And a recording of today's program will be posted to that site in about a week. It also will be posted to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/pedbikeinfo, probably late next week. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. Again, that's facebook.com/pedbike for updates. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. We very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again to our speakers, Christopher Dowse, Bill Schultheis, and Peter Lagerwey, and thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Level Communities webinar.